any other questions from the, okay. All right, so a couple of things that I wanted to, that I'll mention, and then we'll go to some of the questions that came from the field. But so Caleb, and obviously I think others as well, so we can kind of share the microphone, but you kind of talked a lot about the decision making, and I think for this group, which is a lot of folks interested in built environment, real estate professionals, things of that nature, is important. And it actually speaks maybe even to some of the points that Asa and others have made about the why and how we get here. But I am curious for you just to talk a little bit more about that feedback you were given. I think it was a survey where you talked about decision making for projects, i.e. who's responsible for making some of these decisions, right? So we've talked a lot about education, we've talked a lot about the impact of education. So where do we need to focus on, who do we need to focus on educating? Where do we see those decisions to be more interested in decarbonization coming from?
Check. Okay. Well, that's a great question, Tim. So I think there's a broad range that we need to really improve on our education and sustainability. So this is something I promote at FSB a lot, as we do things that we have quite a bit of investment in our sustainable practices. We don't do a great job at the moment when we're working on improving this of displaying what that is. I think we do really well in Oklahoma as well. We do a lot of geothermal. We really are at the heart of the geothermal movement. There's great systems here. There's great buildings being built that are well above the national averages, but we don't do a great job of displaying that and educating that to clients, to developers, to people around. So I think there's an element of educating the public on what it means to build a high-performance building for what we can do right now. I think there's also elements that developers and owners do need some of the technical knowledge. You don't want to overload people with 900 pages of references on LEED and stuff, but to spark that interest and have the discussion of what does it mean to have an investment in sustainability? What does it mean to add to your CapEx by providing some C-based financing, to look at tax credits, to understand what those things are. Those are things that need to be understood by the decision makers who are holding the eventual purse strings in the building, right? And in some senses also, we need to work with the great educational institutes that we have here. Oklahoma State, OU have great opportunities that they're doing research on building materials, building systems. OSU is developing some of the brand new compressor technology and great technology that involves geothermal systems. It's cutting edge for the nation and the world. They're doing it right up the road. So educating between the universities and our architects and engineers here in Oklahoma City is really important. So understanding that we aren't creating new bricks oftentimes, but there are people down the road who are doing that. We're creating new faces of buildings. So we're doing that kind of thing. And so understanding what those options are, some of them are really out of the box and are really unusual. And so they do need some extra education on what that looks like, and is that even an option? You know, cross-laminated timber is not something we do here, but it's done all over the nation. So can we learn from someone on the coast, understand how to do that here and apply it? I think we can. So it's just about educating across the board, I think. Developers, engineers, architects, contractors especially, understanding how to implement those things. Because a lot of systems, you know, VRF system is something that we see a lot too lately that's it's really efficient, it's really easy to use, it's pretty easy to install. It's basically a split system we already use everywhere with just a different refrigerant line. And it's scary to a lot of contractors out there. And so just educating them on what that means, it doesn't have to be that different from what we're already doing. It's really important.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer. I appreciate that, but you also set me up for some I want to follow up on there with some of the things that Candace has talked about as well. So you talked about some of these pieces and sort of where some of that goes, Caleb. One of the things that I made note of is the why. So I know there are a lot of decision makers and a lot of folks who are interested, I mean, obviously we're interested in the topic, but a lot of people who are decision makers in different parts of like the capital stack of how projects just happen. So we got policymakers in the room here, we've got financiers, we've got developers, we've got builders, right? And so when you think about bringing those things together, and you say, why in Oklahoma? So we are an oil and gas state, whether people like it or not, we're all here. Most of us have invested quite a bit of roots here. It is what it is. But when we start looking at regulatory, sort of the way the deck has been stacked. So Caleb kind of talked about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Candace talked about CPACE, and so I want to kind of get to that question. But just to sort of set the tone to reinforce for folks, in Oklahoma there are both challenges, but also advantages, right? And so what I think about when we hear education to me equals a barrier to entry. That's a differentiator for one person's projects or approaches versus the next one. So that's what I kind of want to, I want to get to sort of Candace's point about not starting out in this space or not starting out in that specific focus, but now realizing the advantage that it can create in the market. Because at some point, there will be more robust, more broad education. People will be more aware. The same way we think about glass differently and insulated glass and products. The same way we think about, certain recycled concrete products or recycled steel products. Like, years of energy recovery units, all these things. Years ago, those were not something, but now they got spec, they are. So that barrier to entry, but also this opportunity to align all those different folks in the space in education. Can you speak just a little bit more to that pivot, or pun intended, I guess, for you guys in thinking about the work up front to pull those things together?
Yeah, when I look at, I have to compartmentalize between the different asset classes that we're looking at. And so I think everyone in here kind of probably has a lay of the land of like what our office market is looking like. So we're building an office building and we have a lot of office space on the market and people are only going to pay what they're going to pay. And so those are some of those kind of challenges that we kind of run up against. But I think we can continue to push them, and I think as we're learning, I think we'll eventually get there, and I think our general public and our business community will get there, and they're going to want those things in their buildings and the built environment. We're working on a hotel project, which is a different asset class, and that you're, as a hotel owner or owner of a hotel building, you're essentially an owner of a hotel business. And so you tend to kind of typically think of those systems a little bit differently because all of your operating costs flow in through your business cash flow, right? And so we're able to look at that project and approach that project a little bit differently. I mentioned, briefly about being in Oklahoma. I do think that we benefit from stringent regulation in California. We don't have to abide by it, but they are clearly a driver nationally in creating more energy efficient, mechanical systems, because the mechanical manufacturer, they want to make sure they can provide that system in the state of California, and they have to adhere to this regulation. We don't have kind of this like stringent process of Title IX and all these kind of things. I've worked there before, and so we get a benefit from that, from being in this part of the country.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was thinking about when you're talking about seat-based is we do have very old energy sustainability codes. We tend to follow far behind the national trends in our electrical code updates, things like that. So what it does mean, which is not necessarily the frontline purpose, but it is this back-end purpose. What that means is that you have more incentive because there are more things that qualify for things like PACE. Because our standards are actually easier to exceed, right? So for today, that's not necessarily the long-term intent, but for today, it again is a strategic advantage. So when you start talking about what is happening in Oklahoma, I just think it's important to sort of have that perspective, so I appreciate that. So we did get a question that I want to see if we can address that was a little bit related to our energy code. So this was one from the field, and it said, Oklahoma City's adopted energy code is more than 11 years old. We hear a lot about upfront costs as a barrier to developer support of updates to codes. How can we gain developer support for these badly needed measures? And I think we've got a couple of developers. I'll put Ashley in that category too for the benefit of this. So I don't know if either of you guys would want to take that. I think I just made a case for why we might not want updated codes, but yeah.
That's a little challenging for me, I think, because I don't have to, I hire, professionals who have to adhere to the code, so I kind of don't necessarily understand the inherent challenges with that, I would say, and what that does. But the fact that it hasn't been updated, and we have a project with an out-of-state architect, out-of-state engineer, they're kind of blown away at it, and when I'm like, no, you can finance anything with PACE, and they're like, what? This doesn't make any sense. So that is a reality. I think, I still have to get back to the economics of the project, because those are kind of some of the constraints that I have. And so, if for an office building, for example, I think, if our office market improves, then a lot of those things are going to be desirable, and I don't know if the energy code is going to be, an increased energy code is necessarily going to be a barrier, right? We have a pretty robust multifamily market, you know, and I think, so it's, you know, it's, you know, complying with what your tenants want and what your...
Well, I guess that's what I would add. This is like not fun passing the microphone back and forth, sorry guys. But I think for me, if you're talking about needing to get developers involved, like if you're looking at your pocketbook, you're looking at your bottom line. So while all the financing is great and all of that, like to me, it's going to come back to market demand, especially for us where we're building right now primarily single family versus any sort of multifamily or commercial. As we move forward on that, I think things might change a little bit for us. But you know, if we have people that are specifically interested in geothermal or solar or other energy efficient types of things, then they're going to choose us over a competitor who does not offer those things. And so I think being able to differentiate yourself, whether it's from an office building perspective, like once the market is starting to demand those things at a higher level, I think you'll have developers that are coming in line to offer.
The one thing that I would add to this is, to me, you know, somebody that navigates the building code on every project, I think trying to legislate this through the building code is kind of, in my opinion, the wrong way to do it. Right? I think we all lived through kind of a unique transition in a product that we're all very familiar with that we don't talk about enough, which was light bulbs. Right? I'm sure everybody here was very used to incandescent bulbs, and now we're very used to LED, and it, you know, we just kind of accepted it was what it was. Well, that was legislation, right? There was a specific energy code, I can't remember the name of it, but it was in 2012, that essentially required by 2012, right? That I think it was actually written in 2007, but by 2012, that all lights had to be 25% more efficient or something, right? So it's very hard for like place by place to come in and require these kinds of upgrades in just, well, this place is building code. Because again, people like, you know, the individual stakeholders are going to fight that. There's always going to be holdouts. It's going to make markets, adjacent markets, lopsided, right? Because why am I going to develop right here when I can just go over here and it's cheaper and get the same return or higher return, whatever. I think we have to go a step above building code, and I think these things have to be enacted almost at a national, like, product level in order to see like true adoption and true benefits of full adoption, meaning, you know, driving price down on products.
So,
I have one other. I worked as a lighting designer many years ago in Los Angeles, and so very familiar with working with energy codes there. And at the time, this is pre-LED, right? And at the time, they required single-family homes to install compact fluorescents everywhere. And what you had is you would have everyone install compact fluorescent lights, can lights, and then get their CO and rip them all out and throw them in the garbage and put incandescent back in. So I think there is, to your point, a problem with doing it at such a small level, and that is definitely not sustainable.
yeah.
Well, you don't drive innovation by like, you know, without some kind of pressure. And unfortunately, like, again, we're also, you know, somebody locally might come up with the brilliant idea that like changes the market, but it's more likely that that's going to happen at, you know, the actual places that manufacture and try to market these goods with, you know, people familiar with the processes, that understand the specifics of manufacture that thing, et cetera, et cetera. We need pressure on it. You can't say, oh, well, it's got to come down to the consumer. The consumer's got to apply pressure upwards. We've seen how that works. It doesn't work. You don't get anywhere that way. So the pressure's got to come from above. It's got to be legislation, in my opinion.
So I do think, because I think at this point it's just about the support for updates of the codes, but I'm hearing what you guys are saying, and I think maybe if you just add an air of pragmatism for our environment, I mean, we have, the market is going to push us faster probably than code updates from the policy level. And then, but we do have the pressure of other areas that have different drivers also influencing the market because they're bigger markets. So the real benefit is the fact that you got East and West Coast interests that are gonna influence here, but we have an opportunity really from the market to kind of push innovation probably faster than we can push those things. So another question a little bit related to some of these issues that we've sort of raised that came up from the field as well is about, so we talked about geothermal, we talked about solar. Both of those things have higher upfront costs. I mean, regardless of how you stack them, now they are much more efficient, they do reduce operating costs. And this question is about particularly implementation, something we didn't talk about quite a bit, and I'm not sure if people feel comfortable really being able to take it, but I think we'll take a shot at it. But was about efficiency and systems for affordable projects. So I feel like this is really a little broader conversation about how energy efficiency and those kind of things fit into thinking about affordability, because you have the inherent challenges with doing affordable projects across the board as well. So I'll start with maybe Ashley if you want to take it first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to a current project that we're working on. Some of the 820 guys in here might be familiar with, but we have about 43 single-family homes that we're looking to bring to market between $250,000 and $300,000 at a gross sales price. So these products will be kind of all together. We replatted a section of our project to include them, and we wanted to look at bringing solar to to each of these individual single-family homes. And in an effort to do that and hit our overall gross price point, which was really focused on monthly cost per living and things like that, so that gross price point was really important for us. We are looking at maybe switching to a composite shingle versus our normal 5B metal in order to absorb the cost of the solar. And so for us, it's required a few design changes on that particular product to try and hit that price point. And you can debate affordable price point. For us, that fits within the affordability standards that we're trying to hit. So,
anybody else quickly? On that? Okay, all right, good. We have more, but I wanted to speak to, so that's good. And I actually wasn't setting you up for that because I knew you guys were working on something, but that's the first time I'd heard about it.
That was an 820 plug. We all know it.
Well, I didn't write the question. So along those lines, though, I do want to say that like affordability, typically the ways when you start talking about the real estate environment, the built environment, that you impact that is really through regulation and through incentives. And so the biggest probably impact to affordability is what we talked about a little bit earlier, which is the Inflation Reduction Act. So a little bit to do with inflation, probably for those of us who are political cynics, a lot to do with sustainability. It's probably the largest climate sustainability legislation. I think it is the largest legislation ever passed in the history of the country. And it's uncapped, but it's projected to be hundreds of billions of dollars of impact over the next 10 years and created a lot of certainty in the market. That's really the place where we're probably going to see the biggest opportunity to think about reducing costs in solar or in geothermal or some of these other sustainable practices, because it can take tax credits that are now at 30% for the next 10 years and move them, so you have 10% adders for certain qualified projects, and you can get to a 50 or 60% offset. Those are tax credits that you get to harvest within the first year. So doing the financial math on the backside, you can essentially get a 60%, 70% discount sometimes on the cost of the systems. Those are typically the way we're going to see affordability, because otherwise the costs are what they are, and you have to do things like maybe move back on material, deal with size, footprint, those kind of things. So one other question that came up specific, I think, to some of the conversations, and this was not a plug either, but about Wheeler, and then I want to hit like two things about housekeeping for Caleb. So they'll be related, two things related, and then we'll get to Shane, sorry. Is about why Wheeler wasn't built 100% solar from the start, which I think you kind of can hit on really easily. And then will buildings that are 100% offset actually be cheaper to live in? So this is that building cost versus operating statement as well. So just kind of speaking to maybe lessons learned about those.
yeah, I know that everyone will have plenty to share on this, and maybe, our experience has been on the single family side. In general, it wasn't built 100% solar on the front end because of the cost. Because it is not cheap to install solar. It's also not massively expensive. it really depends. I'll say in the very early days of Wheeler, there were some price per square foot numbers that we were really attempting to hit out of the gate. There you have a whole pile of stuff that goes into that, like appraising houses that are being built on an abandoned air park and things like that in an untested market. And so adding solar to that just complicates everything. So there's like a whole checklist of things that you're working through when you're kicking off a project like that. We have seen so much demand for solar though that we are attempting to implement it where we are able to play with those price per square foot numbers just a little bit. And I will say that we have a ton of residents that are attempting to add it on the back end, and that goes a lot to more tax credits being offered and things like that that are coming online that weren't even available in 2014 when we were starting to kick things off. So.
Yeah, reducing the reducing cost of some of these systems and technologies is probably as much a driver as your intent, because the economics are better today than they were last year.
100%.
All right, so I want to stay on time. I did get an interesting question, I think, for Caleb that will tie to some of the things you were talking about. So it's talking about the difference between decarbonizing, the theme of this conversation, and this idea of actually the fact that we've already sort of set a course. You showed maps that just have us busting through the roof on challenges. And just understanding the difference between decarbonization, a net zero approach versus carbon negative approach. And then the second piece I just wanted you to speak to on the end briefly is how to get more information about your calculator tool.
Yeah, so as far as decarbonize versus net negative carbon is really difficult right now. There are some technologies out there called captured carbon storage. It's very fledgling. It's never really been implemented beyond about 10 megatons of carbon at a time, very small amounts. So I've done some research on that. We had a class on it. It doesn't look like it's going to be very viable commercially for the next 20, 30 years probably. So really what we can do best is mitigate as much carbon as we emit right now. Another interesting factor, didn't really talk about, carbon stays in the atmosphere about 120 to 200 years depending on the situation. So stuff we've already put out there, it's already out there. We can slow things down. It's really complex in the forecasting prediction models that are out there. But methane is another thing that has a really big impact. So if you look at methane, it has about a 25 to 30 times greater impact on the environment than carbon does. We kind of lump them together as a carbon equivalent a lot of times. But it only stays in the atmosphere about 6 years. And so if we start to eliminate our methane, we actually have a much more significant impact on the environmental parts per million in the atmosphere. So there are some things that have changed. Inflation Reduction Act has actually limited the amount of methane that can be produced. A lot of manufacturers for mechanical equipment are changing the way they do things, and methane's been reduced there as well. So there are some things that are out there right now in legislation that's reducing methane quite a bit, which is going to have a pretty big impact on our environment. But really the best we can do is mitigation at the moment, and the best way we can do that is slow things down.
And the tool.
And the tool. So the tool, I'm still working on development of it right now. If you do want to get involved, you can contact me, cdec@fsb-a.com. I'd love to have more people. I've done some demos with it, with developers out there. When I was doing my studies, I worked with about a dozen developers and business owners to do some kind of live feedback and talk about ways we can update that. So if you want to get more involved and help me out with test trialing that, I'd love that. It'd be great.
Good. Appreciate